If you pull a dollar bill out of your pocket right now, you aren't looking at a piece of paper. You're looking at a promise backed by the world's most powerful military, a massive nuclear arsenal, and a $27 trillion economy. When a merchant in Tokyo, Cairo, or Buenos Aires accepts a green paper note today, they don't care about the ink or the cotton fiber. They trust the invisible, crushing weight of the American state standing behind it. The US dollar is the default currency of planet Earth. It prices our global oil, it settles our international debt, and it sits safely inside the central bank reserves of every major power. It feels permanent. It feels inevitable. But if you stepped back in time just a little over a century ago, the global financial system looked completely different. Back then, if an international trader held a piece of American paper money, they looked at it with deep, cold suspicion. The dollar wasn't the master of the world. It was a chaotic, volatile, and highly experimental currency operating on the dangerous fringes of global finance. And its journey from a local backwater currency to the undisputed king of global trade wasn't a master plan. It was a chaotic chain reaction, built on a series of quiet panic attacks, secret island meetings, and the two most destructive wars in human history. For the first 100 years of American history, the concept of a US dollar was a mess. Before the Civil War, there was no single unified green paper currency floating around the United States. Instead, thousands of local, state-chartered banks issued their own private paper bills. If you walked into a general store in Ohio with a $10 bill issued by a small bank in Georgia, the shopkeeper wouldn't just take it. They would pull out a thick leather-bound book, called a counterfeit detector guide, to check if that Georgia bank was even solvent or if that specific bill was worth 50 cents on the dollar. Counterfeiting was rampant. Bank failures were a daily occurrence. If a bank went under on a Thursday, its paper money turned into literal trash by Friday morning. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's government finally created the first official, uniform paper currency, the greenback, to finance the Union military. It was a necessary leap forward for domestic survival. But on the international stage, the European empires simply laughed at it. In the late 1800s, global trade had one undisputed king, the British pound sterling. The British Empire controlled the sea routes, they laid the global telegraph cables under the oceans, and they anchored their currency strictly to gold. If a merchant in South America wanted to trade with a manufacturer in Asia, they didn't write contracts in US dollars. They wrote them in British pounds, processed through the venerable financial houses in London. London was the beating heart of world commerce. New York was just a chaotic, loud, and unpredictable sideshow. European investors viewed the American economy much like modern investors view a high-risk emerging market today, massive potential, but prone to wild, violent financial crashes. And those crashes happened with terrifying regularity. In 1873, 1893, and 1907, the American banking system collapsed like a house of cards. There was no central bank to step in and provide a safety net. During the Panic of 1907, the entire U.S. financial system was saved from total disintegration not by the government, but by a single private individual, the legendary banker J.P. Morgan. He literally locked the doors to his library, gathered the most powerful Wall Street executives, and forced them to pool their private funds to stop the bank runs. It was a wake-up call. America was becoming an industrial titan, producing more steel and laying more railroad track than any nation in history. Yet, its financial system was held together by nothing more than duct tape and the personal whims of private billionaires. European leaders knew it. American financiers knew it. Something had to give. In November of 1910, a private train car with frosted windows slipped quietly out of a station in New Jersey. Inside sat 6 men, top government officials, powerful Wall Street bankers, and representatives of the Rockefeller and Morgan empires. They traveled under fake names, telling their families they were going on a duck hunting trip. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a secluded private retreat off the coast of Georgia. For 10 days in total suffocating secrecy, these men drafted a blueprint for a master institution designed to stabilize American finance and project its power outward. That secret meeting laid the legal groundwork for the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law in 1913. America finally had a modern central bank. It finally had the machinery required to issue a stable currency that could operate on the world stage. But having the machine wasn't enough. To overthrow a reigning monarch like the British pound, you need a seismic shift in the global order. That shift arrived just 8 months after the Federal Reserve was created in the summer of 1914. When World War I exploded across Europe, the old financial system shattered overnight. The great European empires, Britain, France, Germany, began spending unimaginable sums of money to buy artillery, ammunition, food, and fuel. To pay for the slaughter, these nations abandoned the gold standard, printing massive amounts of paper money to fund the bloodshed. Their currencies inflated. Their debts skyrocketed. America, sitting safely across the Atlantic, remained neutral for the first 3 years of the conflict. U.S. factories and farms worked day and night, supplying the warring nations with everything they needed to survive. But the Allies didn't pay for these goods with promises. They paid with physical gold. Ships loaded with heavy wooden crates of gold bars sailed across the Atlantic into New York Harbor. By the time the war ended in 1918, the financial map of the world had been completely inverted. Europe was devastated, physically broken, and drowning in massive debt. America was left holding the vast majority of the world's physical gold reserves. London was no longer the world's primary lender. Wall Street was. For the first time in history, global trade contracts began shifting from the pound to the dollar. The greenback had finally stepped into the light. Over the next 20 years, through the decadence of the Roaring Twenties and the crushing weight of the Great Depression, the dollar fought to hold that position. But its final, undisputed crowning didn't happen on a trading floor in Manhattan. It happened in a small, quiet resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire in July 1944. With World War II drawing to a close, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. European economies were once again in total ruins. America held roughly 3/4 of all the official gold on Earth. At Bretton Woods, a new global financial architecture was drafted. The world leaders agreed to tie their national currencies directly to the U.S. dollar at fixed exchange rates. And the U.S. government made a single solemn promise to the world. The Federal Reserve would redeem any U.S. dollar held by a foreign government for physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The dollar was officially anchored to gold, and every other currency on Earth was anchored to the dollar. The crown had officially been passed. When you look at that dollar bill today, you aren't just looking at a paper note. You are looking at the survivor of a century of financial chaos, secret island meetings, and world wars. It didn't become the global reserve currency by accident or magic. It took over the world because, when the dust settled on the 20th century, it was the last thing left standing. But as history shows us, no currency stays at the top forever. Every empire in history believed its money was permanent, right up until the moment the global tide quietly turned once again.